The deed to my house was sitting on the kitchen table the morning everything changed. I had set it there the night before, the way I sometimes do when I can't sleep, pulling out the things that matter, the things my wife and I built together over 40 years, just to remind myself that it was all real. The paper was worn soft at the folds. We had signed it together on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1987, her handwriting looping and certain next to mine. I remember she had worn a blue dress that day. I remember the notary had a mustache and smelled like pipe tobacco. I remember thinking, this is ours now. Nobody can take this from us. I was wrong about that last part. It was a Tuesday in late August when I first noticed something was off. The heat in Chattanooga had been relentless that summer. The kind that sits on your chest when you walk outside and doesn't let go. I had been spending most mornings on the back porch with my coffee, watching the birds at the feeder my wife had put up 22 years ago, the one I repainted every spring even though there was no longer anyone around to notice whether I did or not. I was 63 years old. I had retired from the contracting business 2 years prior. My days were quiet, and I had made my peace with that quietness, mostly. My son had called me 3 times that week. That was the first thing that felt wrong. He lived 40 minutes away in Hickson with his wife and their 2 kids, and under ordinary circumstances, I was lucky to hear from him once every 10 days. He was a busy man. He worked long hours at the logistics company where he'd been a manager for 6 years, and his wife kept a full schedule of her own. I understood that. I had never been the kind of father who counted phone calls, but 3 times in 1 week, each one short, each one asking the same kinds of questions wrapped in different words. How was I feeling? Was I keeping up with the yard? Had I thought any more about maybe looking at some of those 55 and older communities out near East Brainerd? That last question had come up before. It had started about 4 months after my wife passed, which was 14 months before that August, and it had never fully gone away. My daughter-in-law was the one who usually brought it up, usually at Sunday dinners, usually with a certain brightness in her voice that I had learned to recognize as the brightness people use when they've already made up their minds about something and are simply waiting for you to agree. She was not a cruel woman. I want to be fair about that. But she was a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that my house was a problem to be solved. It is a good house. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, on a corner lot with 2 oak trees my father planted when I was 6 years old. My wife and I raised our son in that house. We buried our dog in the backyard under the oak trees. We painted every room at least 3 times, always arguing about colors, always ending up choosing something we both loved. The house is paid off. It has been paid off for 9 years, and according to the tax assessor's office, it is worth somewhere between $400,000 and $430,000 depending on the quarter. I am not a suspicious man by nature. My wife always said I was too willing to believe the best of people, that I handed out trust the way some men handed out business cards freely and without much deliberation. But something about those 3 phone calls sat in my stomach in a way I could not shake. So that Thursday morning, before the heat had fully settled in, I drove over to see my neighbor. He lives 3 houses down, in the brick ranch he bought the same year I bought mine. We were young men together on this street. We coached Little League together for 6 years. When my wife got sick, he was the one who mowed my lawn without being asked, who left covered dishes on my porch on Sunday evenings, who sat with me on the back steps the night she passed and didn't say a single word because there was nothing to say and he knew it. He is 71 years old, and he has seen enough of life to know when something is worth worrying about. I told him about the phone calls. I told him about the questions. I told him that my son had mentioned, in the last call, that he had been talking to somebody who handled estate planning and senior transitions, and that this person had some ideas that might be worth my time to hear. My neighbor set down his coffee mug and looked at me for a long moment. There are men who pause before they speak because they're gathering their thoughts. And there are men who pause because they already know what they want to say, and they are deciding how much of it to share. He was the second kind. He said he had seen my son's car parked in front of my house twice in the past 2 weeks, both times on weekday afternoons, when I would normally have been at the hardware store or at my Thursday card game at the VFW, both times for about 45 minutes. He hadn't mentioned it because he figured maybe we had planned it and he'd misunderstood. But now that I was telling him this, he didn't think that anymore. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I am a contractor's son and a contractor myself. I have spent my entire adult life solving problems with my hands, measuring twice before I cut, checking the load-bearing walls before I ever touched anything structural. I did not panic. I made a plan. The following Friday, I told my son I was going up to visit my old Army friend in Knoxville for 10 days. I told my daughter-in-law the same thing when she called Saturday morning. I packed a bag loudly and visibly. I even posted a photo on Facebook of the highway ramp heading north, something I almost never do, because I knew my daughter-in-law checked my Facebook. Then I drove to a budget inn 6 miles from my house, paid cash for 3 nights, and settled in to wait. My neighbor had a key to the house. We had each other's keys had for 15 years, ever since the time I locked myself out on Christmas Eve and he had to drive 40 minutes back from his daughter's house to let me in. I called him from the motel that Saturday afternoon and told him what I needed. I needed him to keep his eyes open. I needed to know the moment anyone came by. He said, without any hesitation at all, that he would call me. The first 2 days were uneventful. I sat in that motel room with the History Channel and eating food from a gas station 2 blocks away, and feeling, more than once, like a fool. I was a 63-year-old man hiding in a budget inn 6 miles from his own home because his son had called him too many times. I told myself on Sunday evening that if nothing happened by Tuesday, I would go home, unpack my bag, and find a better way to have the conversation I apparently needed to have with my son. Monday passed. Tuesday morning passed. Tuesday afternoon, at 2:47, my neighbor called. He said there were 2 cars in front of my house. One was my son's. The other he didn't recognize. A dark gray sedan, newer model. My son and his wife had gone inside. The third person from the gray sedan had also gone inside. They had been in there for about 20 minutes by the time he called me. I asked him to watch the door and let me know when they left. Then I sat on the edge of the motel bed and breathed slowly and tried to hold on to the version of myself that measured twice before cutting. They were inside for 1 hour and 14 minutes. When they left, my neighbor read me the license plate of the gray sedan. I wrote it down on the back of a gas station receipt and looked at it for a while. I know people. 35 years of contracting means you accumulate a certain number of favors from a certain number of people across a wide range of industries. One of those people is a woman I had done extensive renovation work for back in 2009, who now works as an office manager for a law firm that handles estate and probate cases in Hamilton County. I am not going to say more than that about her or how she helped me, except to say that the favor she did me was legal. It cost her nothing professionally, and I have since sent her a very nice fruit basket and a handwritten thank you note. What she told me, without telling me too much, was that the name associated with that license plate belonged to a man who worked as a legal documents specialist. Not a licensed attorney, a specialist. The kind of person hired to facilitate paperwork. The kind of paperwork that, in certain contexts, might involve a power of attorney, or a deed transfer, or the restructuring of an estate while the primary owner was understood to be declining in health or judgment. I sat with that for a long time. There is a grief that comes before the anger, and it is worse than the anger. The anger at least has somewhere to go. The grief just sits in you like groundwater, cold and heavy, and with no clear surface. My son had stood beside me at his mother's funeral. He had cried in a way I hadn't seen him cry since he was a small boy. He had held my arm in the parking lot afterward and said, "It's just us now, Dad." And I had believed him completely. The way you believe the things people say to you on the worst day of your life. I thought about that for a long time in that motel room. Then I stopped thinking about it and started working. I contacted a licensed estate attorney, not through my neighbor at the law firm, but independently, through the State Bar Referral Service, so that everything was clean and documented from the start. I met with her on Wednesday morning. I brought the deed, the most recent property tax records, the original mortgage payoff documentation, my will as it currently stood, and everything else I could think of that established the clear and undisputed history of my ownership of that house. I told her what I suspected. I told her about the cars, the license plate, the document specialist. I told her about the months of gentle pressure to move to a senior community, about the estate planning conversations my son had mentioned, about the 3 phone calls in 1 week. She listened without interrupting. She is a careful woman, this attorney, and I liked her immediately for that. When I finished, she said there were several things she wanted to do right away, and one of them was to ensure that any future attempt to alter the legal status of my property would require my direct, in-person, witness consent, not a phone call, not a signature on a document delivered to my home, but my physical presence before a notary and 2 independent witnesses. She also said I should go home. I drove back that Wednesday afternoon, and I unpacked my bag, and I made myself a pot of coffee, and I sat on the back porch and watched the birds at my wife's feeder for a long time. The oak trees my father had planted were casting long shadows across the yard in the late afternoon light. They were large trees now, 60-plus years of growing. They were not going anywhere. My son called Thursday morning. He was cheerful, the particular kind of cheerful that requires effort. He asked how Knoxville had been. He asked if I was eating well. He said he'd been thinking. And there was this financial planning fellow he'd been talking to who had some really sensible ideas about long-term asset management for people in my situation. And would I be open to just a conversation? No pressure, just to hear the options? I said sure. I said that sounded reasonable. I said I had actually been doing some thinking of my own, and that I had just met with an attorney to update my estate documents, and I wanted him to know that everything was now in very good order. There was a silence on the line, not a long silence, maybe 3 seconds. But I have known my son for 40 years, and I know the texture of his silences, the way I know the texture of wood grain. I can read the species by touch. This silence was not the silence of a man processing neutral information. It was the silence of a man recalibrating. He said that was great, Dad. He said it was good to stay on top of those things. He said he'd be in touch. He didn't call again for 11 days. In those 11 days, I learned more than I had perhaps wanted to know. The attorney my son had been dealing with, not the document specialist, but the actual attorney behind the specialist, had been contacted at least twice on my son's behalf. The conversations, as best as could be determined, had centered on questions about cognitive capacity assessments and the legal thresholds for challenging an existing estate plan on grounds of diminished judgment. My son, apparently, had been laying groundwork. I will not tell you that this didn't hurt. It did. It hurt in the specific way that betrayals hurt when they come from people you made, people you drove to soccer practice and helped with algebra homework and danced with at their wedding. My daughter-in-law I could make a certain kind of peace with. She was ambitious and practical, and she had married into a situation where $400,000 in real estate was sitting in the hands of a 63-year-old widower who showed no signs of needing assisted care. I understood the math she was doing even if I found it contemptible. My son was different. My son had no excuse except greed and weakness, and I had not raised him to be weak, and I found that harder to carry than all the rest of it combined. But I am my father's son, and my father was a builder, and builders do not demolish what can be repaired. They assess the structure. They determine what is load-bearing. They decide, very carefully, what stays and what has to go. I called my son on a Sunday afternoon. I asked him to come by the house the following evening. Just the 2 of us. I did not tell him why. He hesitated. I could hear him covering the phone and speaking briefly to his wife, and then said yes, he'd be there around 6. He arrived at 6:03. I had made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just the chicken and rice dish his mother used to make that he had always loved. We ate at the kitchen table without much conversation. He seemed watchful. I seemed calm. Both of those things were genuine. After dinner, I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down and told him what I knew. I did not raise my voice. I did not use the word betrayal. I described the events in order: the phone calls, the cars, the license plate, the estate attorney, the conversations about cognitive capacity, and I watched his face move through several different expressions before settling into something that was not quite shame, but was in the neighborhood of it. He started to say something about just looking out for me. He started to say something about the house being a lot for one person to manage. I let him say those things. I did not interrupt. Then I told him about the changes I had made to my estate plan. The house would remain mine, fully and legally, for as long as I was living. There was now a provision requiring independent cognitive assessment by 2 licensed clinicians before any challenge to my legal capacity could be entertained, and given that I was in excellent health, read 2 books a week, managed my own finances, and had just successfully run a 10-day covert operation from a budget inn, I felt comfortable about how that assessment would come out. My property was in a revocable trust that I controlled entirely and that he had no role in administering, and I had retained the attorney on an ongoing basis. I told him that none of this was anger. It was just clarity. I told him that I loved him, that I would always love him because that was not something you switched off, but that trust was a different thing from love, and it would take time to rebuild. I told him that I needed him to be honest with his wife about this conversation, and that she needed to understand it too. He sat across from me for a long time without speaking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, through the window, I could see one of my father's oak trees in the last of the evening light. Finally, he said he was sorry. He said it quietly, looking at his coffee cup. He said he hadn't thought about it as betrayal, that in his mind he had been worried about me, that his wife had convinced him I was struggling more than I let on, that the house was a liability, that I would be better off liquid. He said he knew, saying it out loud to me, that those were rationalizations. He said he was sorry again. I told him I heard him. I did not tell him everything was fine, because it wasn't yet. I did not tell him I forgave him completely, because complete forgiveness needs time, and I was not going to insult either of us by pretending. But I told him we could work towards something. I told him that was still possible. He left around 8:30. I stood on the front porch and watched his headlights back out of the driveway. The street was quiet, the way streets are quiet on Sunday evenings. A stillness that feels earned, like the neighborhood itself has had a long week and is glad it's almost over. My neighbor's porch light was on. I could see his silhouette in the window, the way I had seen it 1,000 times over the years, the way you get used to the shapes of people who have been in your life long enough to become part of the landscape. I raised a hand. He raised one back. I went inside and locked the door and sat in the kitchen alone for a while. The deed was still on the table. I had pulled it out again that morning without really meaning to. I straightened the edges of it and laid my hand flat on the paper. The fold lines were soft from years of handling. My wife's handwriting was still there, looping and certain, next to mine. This is ours, I had thought, the day we signed it. Nobody can take this from us. 40 years later, sitting in the kitchen of the house, my father's oak trees still shaded, I thought, I was right about that after all. I thought about my wife for a while. I thought about the way she used to say that the most powerful thing a person could do in a moment of injustice was stay clear-headed, because a clear head was the one thing that nobody could take from you without your permission. She had been smarter than me about most things, and I had spent the last 14 months learning just how wide that gap was. I put the deed back in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet, where it lived between the moments I needed to remind myself of things. I washed the dinner dishes. I checked that the back door was locked. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. In the morning, I called my attorney and thanked her again. I called my neighbor and told him it had gone as well as it could. He said, in the way that people say the truest things briefly, without decoration, that he was glad, and that my wife would have been proud of how I handled it. I said I hoped so. I had not done this for drama. I had not done it for victory. I am 63 years old. I have buried my parents and my wife. I have built things with my hands that I can still drive past and see standing. I have come to understand that the things worth protecting are rarely the things you can count. They are the oak trees your father planted. They are the handwriting of someone you loved on a document that says, simply, this is where we live. This is what we made. This is ours. I had protected those things, not with anger, not with lawyers wielded as weapons, but with the same quiet precision I had brought to every structure I had ever built. Measure twice. Know what's load-bearing. Don't cut until you're certain. The birds were at the feeder when I came out to the back porch that morning. A pair of cardinals, a few sparrows. one fat squirrel attempting and failing to access the seed from below. I refilled my coffee and sat in my chair and watched them, and let the morning do what mornings do. My son called 4 days later. He said his wife wanted to apologize in person and asked if they could come to Sunday dinner. I said yes. He said the kids were asking about Grandpa and whether they could see the house. I said bring them. That Sunday, I made the chicken and rice again. My daughter-in-law sat across from me and said what she needed to say, and I listened to her say it, and I told her I appreciated it and I meant that. The kids ate everything on their plates and then asked to go look at the oak trees, which they had always been fascinated by. And my son took them out to the backyard while his wife and I sat at the table for a moment alone. She looked at me and said she hadn't realized how much that house meant to me. Not as an asset, as a place. I told her it was where I had lived my whole adult life. I told her the squirrel in the backyard was probably a descendant of a squirrel I had watched as a 40-year-old man. I told her my wife's handwriting was on the deed and that no amount of money was going to make me want to transfer that away. She nodded, and for the first time since I had known her, which was coming up on 14 years, she looked like she genuinely understood me, not as a problem or a circumstance, but as a person. Outside, I could hear my son explaining to his kids just how old those trees were, that their great-grandfather had planted them, that some trees could live for hundreds of years if you took care of them and left them alone to grow. I could hear the wonder in the kids' voices, that unself-conscious wonder that children have before they learn to pretend they are not amazed by things. I stayed at that table a little longer than I needed to, listening to my son's voice in the yard where my father's trees were still growing, in the house my wife and I had made ours together, in the life that nobody had managed to take from me after all. Some things, I have come to believe, are worth every quiet and careful effort it takes to protect them, not because they are expensive or because they can be appraised, but because they are the shape of who you are, because they are where your people are buried and where your memories live, and where the handwriting of someone you loved is still pressed into paper in a fireproof box in the closet. I am not a man given to speeches or declarations, but if I were to say one thing about all of it, the motel room, the license plate, the attorney, the dinner, all of it, I would say this: getting older does not mean getting weaker. It means you have had more time to figure out what matters and more practice at protecting it. I knew what mattered. I protected it, and I did it, without once losing myself in the process. My wife would have called that the only real victory. She was right, the way she was right about most things. The oak trees are still standing. I painted the bird feeder last April. The deed is in the fireproof box. Everything that should be here is still here.